How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylai Hobby Time. Today I'm going to be trying something new. I wanted to recreate a tiny single-action army revolver for the Wild Imaginary West, almost entirely made from scratch, and I'll be using styrene for most of it. Actually, aside from a few little details, the barrel and the handle are basically the only things on this build that are not made from styrene. I found a brass tube in my assorted metal tube and pipe box that was the right width, and I trimmed it down to the right length as well, and then I scaled the rest of the pieces to match the barrel, which came out to about 1/2 scale. And you may be wondering why I decided to make a 1/2 scale revolver from scratch rather than a full-sized one, and it's because I did something similar with a customized air rifle about a year ago, and that video almost got demonetized, and the reason was gun creation or illegal modifications, which is kind of funny if you watched the video. Anyway, I appealed that decision, and I pointed out that the parts that I had added to the air rifle were a bendy plastic bayonet and a monster heartbeat sensor from an imaginary Wild Western universe. The computer held its position, so did the first human reviewer, but thankfully, the second person who looked at it with the context that I had provided, and they ruled that it was okay for monetization. So this time around, I figured that a video showing me making a decorative replica toy scale model from almost completely plastic at 1/2 scale would be less likely to cause confusion for the computer and the first human reviewer. Also, machining it from styrene seemed like a fun challenge. The approach I took with this build was to find the shape of a part and cut it out on as many layers of styrene as I needed. And then I welded them together using some plastic cement until they were one solid piece of styrene. And then I would file and shape the details from there. Also, if you start a word counter for the word styrene in this video, you'll count a lot of them. I found that the most difficult part of this build to get right was definitely the cylinder. I almost used a receipt paper roll because it was the right size, but there wasn't a realistic way to carve any grooves in it without ruining it because the walls were a little too thin. I was still able to use it as a size reference though, so after I combined 7 short styrene tubes and made sure they fit, I got rid of the paper roll and I went with the option of heating up a strip of styrene with a heat gun and then forming it around a round object which was about the right size so that it would hold its shape. There was a small seam in the styrene which I'm able to hide pretty easily, depending on how I put it in here. I also carved some grooves off camera using a file. Another thing I did off camera was to use the bandsaw to cut away large sections like you see here. There were a bunch of unsightly gaps on the front of this cylinder, which I was able to patch up with Tamiya putty because they were small enough, and after that was dry, I sanded it smooth. I followed all the same steps to create the handle and the lower half of the revolver, and the original plan was to add the spring and all the other working mechanisms, but I found that working with an X-Acto blade by hand and styrene at this scale was a lot harder to be precise with than I expected. Also, having no moving parts does help build my case if they try to demonetize the video. I also made sure to double check the sizing of everything before moving on because these parts each took me a very long time to make, and I didn't want to have to go back and remake anything. I drilled a couple holes, and then I made a trigger and a hammer, and I stuck those in place using some small brass pins, another element of this build that is not styrene. Then I left them pivotable because I did not want to glue them in place just yet until I knew that I had a position where they would look good, and after that, then I cemented them in place. I wanted to have some bullets visible from the front, so I lathed a piece of model kit sprue using a drill and a file. Additionally, I cut up 6 little tube sections to act as the casings, and they're a little thick, but from the front, I think they look alright. Once the bullets were all in place, it was time for assembly. And as I assemble this, I just want to remind whoever it concerns, this is a non-functioning plastic scale replica of a revolver. With all the metal parts of this 6-shooter together, it was time to carve a handle. But before that, I wanted to do a little bit of cleanup. I I grabbed a small plank of pine, which will be easy enough to work with, and I traced out the shape that I needed for the handle. I then brought my bandsaw over to the workbench, and I carefully cut along the penciled line. Once I had the rough shape cut out and I knew it was going to work, I cut out a second one, and then I cut each of them in half, tapered wider at the bottom, before gluing them directly to the styrene on the handle. And gluing it definitely felt a little bit risky, but I also knew that it was going to be the easiest way to handle this thing and get the shape that I was looking for. I then broke out my Dremel 3000 with a sanding drum and I went to town. Once it had been shaped, I sanded the wood to a nice smooth finish and I added some little fake flathead screws, which are just rhinestones which I flipped upside down. I carved a channel in each of them using an engraving tool to make them look like screws. With that, the construction was done, and it may not be perfect, but I'm really happy with this dinky little Peacemaker. The next step was to mask off all of the wood and begin painting. I flipped my hobby mat over to dark mode, and then I loaded up my airbrush with a black primer. And while I paint this thing, I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons. Once the primer had been applied and had time to dry, I slapped on a layer of liquid mirror. Stuart Semple, who's the guy who keeps releasing new software updates for black paint, also has some other fun paint products like this one in his catalog. The silver seemed to highlight all of the imperfections on the surface of the styrene, so I decided to tint it to a more gunmetal look. And I really like the combination of the gunmetal and light wood, but I had a plan for this thing that takes it beyond just the normal scale replica of a Peacemaker and sets it in the world of the Wild Imaginary West. I changed the wood on the handle to look like rosewood, and there is a lore reason for doing this. A faction that I've referenced in my videos a number of times is the Pinkertons. The Pinkerton Agency still exists in real life today, and so as not to stir up any complaints from them, we came up with a new name for the Wild Imaginary West equivalent, and that is the Purpletons. Just kidding. It's the Rosewood Security Agency, and the signature of all of their agents is that the wood on their weapons is made from richly colored and expensive rosewood. There will be many normal weapons in the Wild Imaginary West, but naturally I wanted something unnormal because I'm trying to expand the lore for you guys to get a better picture of what's happening in the universe. While the Rosewoods have some significant firepower in their arsenal, they also have a more sneaky side. Part of their company is dedicated to large-scale defense, the other is investigation and bounty hunting. Which is why I decided to equip this revolver with a non-lethal underbarrel tranquilizer dart launcher. The dart can be used without launching if the agent gets close enough, but can also be fired from a distance with the press of a button located within reach of the right thumb. Agents from the undercover branch of the agency are most often hired to hunt persons of interest, rather than hunting monsters, and often those persons are wanted alive. In the Wild Imaginary West RPG, the Rosewoods will be a large faction that can be worked with or against depending on the situation. You may even find yourself being hunted by them if you're not careful. With the parts done, I could flip my hobby mat over to painting mode once again and color the attachments. And once painted, I installed them on the revolver. The next thing to do was to build a display stand for this thing to sit on. I recently purchased a router and router table, and I'm pretty excited to be able to make my bases a little more dynamic going forward. After sanding the base, I used my Dremel and a drum sander to create the upright portion of the display stand. And after a quick sanding and some glue, I stained the whole thing using a gel stain. I sealed the display stand with some satin varnish, and the last thing to do was to put some felt sticker feet on the bottom. Then I put my revolver in place, and I called it good. that is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. A huge shout out, as always, to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.